Hi.
Hello. So disclaimer, this will be messy, always is. And so I'm going to let Roberto lead, and I'm going to interrupt him, basically.
Yeah,
Okay.
we thought that we were going to explain we've done a little fanzine for the summit, and we thought we will explain because it's full of like sort of some obscure like pretty English kind of references. But I think that maybe the explanation is going to make it worse. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. So this is the scene, and it's done in collaboration with another member of the goldsmiths tribe, that is Stuart Bannock's. And basically, I think that the the fanzine, we follow Jessica's text, and we divided it in like 3 sections. So it's looking at time. So the first section is like really looking at the idea of the ephemeral and permanent. And then there is a section about how we try to cheat time. And then another section about containers of time, somehow, no? Time machines and time capsules. So like I said, it's like we have like this illusion of like, or this drive to make things permanent, although we know that we are in contradiction, that everything in our lives is transitional, so it's ephemeral, so it's just a question of a time scale. So that's why we're a bit what we are trying to look at now. So it's like from these 2 words, then you start analyzing things, and you realize that there are things that they live in the middle. No? There are these things that are planned as permanent, but in reality they become really ephemeral. So it's like that we call permeral, the ephemeral destiny of the permanent. And it's like examples like the Igo Pruitt building, like buildings that, or projects that had this idea that what they were going to solve the world and ended up being destroyed within the generation of the same creator of it. And in these same lines, you have things like Forlandia, like master plans that then they get built as the answer to all the industrial problems of the Ford manufacturing company, and get destroyed just by a poor diet in the...
Yeah, all the problems started in the canteen, and the revolution started because the food was so bad they had to eat this American food, and that was the beginning of the internal revolution.
I mean, Forlandia, if you don't know, is that at some
stage... It's true.
At some stage, Ford decided that it was a better idea to take the manufacturing company to Brazil, that it was the source of all the rubber for the tires, that it was the only thing that they could not produce in the States. But anyway, and it's the same thing with Detroit. I mean, I'm sure that you are all familiar, and it's quite amazing how something that is from our time gets deteriorated and becomes completely obsolete in the course of some tens of years, really. And by the same thing, we are encountered all the time with things that are, or we build ephemeral, and we have to end up living with them because there is no better solution sometimes, or sometimes just we like them too much, like the Eiffel Tower. So it's like these structures that they build with an idea of time, but then they just...
And celebration of its moment.
Yeah. I mean, what is interesting, I think you'll see a lot of images that are taken from iMaps. So as you know, what is interesting for us is like, there is also an Eiffel Tower in Las Vegas, which is a different Eiffel Tower, but within the iMaps models is the same model. So in the digital world, the 2 Eiffel Towers are exactly the same Eiffel Tower. Or the London Eye, that has become this thing that it was going to be only like a millennium celebration device, is become like a permanent feature in London. And then we have all these things that live in a permanent state of becoming. No? So it's like famous things like I don't know, the Great Wall of China, that took 4,000 years to build. It was built in sections, so it's like by the time they started building the first sections, they had to be renovated in those same sections and try to build. So it's like if you try to imagine what is to live with 4,000 years with the promise of something that never happens. It's quite interesting. And it's going back to this idea precisely of the perception of time. No? It's like for a culture like Chinese culture, when you think that you have a sense of being from like 4,700 years, they celebrated this just last week. It is a very different sense that if, for example, you are a Spaniard and you have, how much? 500, 600 years, if we are trying to overplay
No,
it.
we have more than 500 years.
No. Not as Spanish people.
Yeah, I mean, what is to be a Spanish?
Because we've always been like a mix of things. So it's like this idea of what is the timeline. So for us, what does it mean 50 years is a lot, but for a Chinese person, maybe it's not so much. And then from there, we started, like I say, looking at land art in a way. And it's a bit of our heckler side that is always looking at what are the common things in terms of what you see. So it's like, for example, this is an image of California City. California, oh my God, I need water.
Yeah.
California City it was a project that started by this maverick guy. He was called Nate Mandelson. Basically, he was a university professor. He cashed all his money. He bought this land in California. And suddenly had the idea he was going to design from scratch what it was going to become the third largest city in California. So he started building all these roads out of nothing, and it's still, I think nowadays there are 13,000 people, but it was designed for 3 million people. So it is quite, but still when you see it, it still has that same resonance with other things like we were saying, the Smithsonian, or it has that same sense of intent that makes you think about what's their origin or what it could be. And in the same way, so if we start from the city, we got to start interpreting certain things as maybe urban plans. So maybe this was also a racing track or some sort of like urban planning. So it's like it takes you to think that maybe land art, when we look at this if you are just encountered with these things that we see in books, is maybe, it was just a form of abstraction that is being brought back to figurativism with aerial photography. So it's like, we could also see like the Serra Navas giant maybe was like a real master plan for a kind of Roman village in honor of this god. No? So again, it is all these things that we are seeing. What are they? Are they art? Are they eyesores? I don't know. I guess it's like the eyesore is an aesthetic disagreement, normally between one person and a group of persons that they have a very strong sense of style. So I think that this is what we were trying to do. You know, it's like this idea of the mystery of the unknown, of an author that brings a kind of story to it, or suddenly when we are able to recognize things, and it creates a different narrative that we can maybe rebel against. So from there, like I was saying, it's like now it's like looking at what does it mean to restore or to preserve things. And this more, I mean, in the book we include like a little story, and it's just really trying to look at something completely ridiculous to try to preserve, or try to collect. No? So we are looking at, we start with a concert we went when we were younger, a gig by the Stray Cats in Paris. And it's like, it's still something that is in your memory, no? So as a collector of these things, you can choose to do the standard thing, or what we did, keep your ticket, buy the T-shirt, buy the records. But you can imagine that maybe if your ambition is larger as a collector and you're trying to really collect the artists, you would like to see them perform. Maybe if you have a record label, you will support their artists maybe like a gallery does. But maybe you can collect it like an owner of a Las Vegas casino will do. So I could offer Brian Setzer a massive contract to just play for me in my casino every Friday for the rest of his life. And maybe if I really want to even collect or become more ridiculous, we could try to say, well, no, actually what I wanted to collect is just that moment when I was there and I had you next to me. So I had to kidnap you, bring you, how you start having to recreate all this moment. And every time you're trying to collect the uncollectible, the expense becomes bigger and bigger. No? So, I mean, we were looking at these kinds of things, no? The restoration. And this is quite an interesting case. I don't know if you've heard.
Well, here it is, and you made it happen.
Rennie McIntosh house in Glasgow.
The pioneering shield will
and
help
it's one of the
save
few
the Hill House.
houses that
It's an amazing feat of
with the
engineering,
Glasgow
and when it's
School of
finished,
Art
it will
is
shelter
the only other
Macintosh's
building
masterpiece
of his
from
that
the
is
rain
left.
and wind.
So the building
Such a
started
toll
to corrupt,
over
so
the
they
past
decided to build a house
just the
on
first
top
stage.
of the house
Once under cover,
to preserve
the
it.
building can dry out under controlled conditions.
Oh, what happened? Ah, no, that is good.
Well, here it is, and you made it happen. We're well on the way to completing the box. The pioneering shield will help save the Hill House. It's an amazing feat of engineering, and when it's finished, it will shelter Macintosh's masterpiece from the rain and wind that have taken such a toll over the past century.
So
That's just the first
allegedly,
stage.
the whole works
Once
is
under
planned
cover,
for 10
the
years.
building can dry out under
So-
controlled conditions.
In theory, after 10 years, it will be taken down.
Well, here it
But
is,
we
and you
think
made
that
it happen.
this is going to
We're well
become
on the way
one
to
of these
completing the box.
permanent
The pioneering
features,
shield will
because
help
the
save
reality is
the
that
Hill House.
it is really
It's an
cool
amazing
to
feat
see
of
that
engineering,
house
and when it's finished,
inside that
it will
house. So
shelter
as a
Macintosh's
tourist,
masterpiece.
I think
But
that's
not the neighbors, because this is you bought a house by this house, and now the house that you love to look at is going to have a glass house around, and it's going to have thousands of tourists. So definitely it's going to change the environment for all the neighbors. So they will call this
Well, here it is.
house they used to love
You
the
made it
eyesore
happen.
of
We're
the
well on
of
way
the
to
world.
completing the box. The pioneering
So this is like
Well,
a
here it
little
is,
story that
and you
we
made it
use
happen.
in the
We're well on the
fanzine
way
to
to
kind of
completing
introduce
the
this
box.
dialogue between the thing that is exposed to time, to the weather. And so it's like a kind of conversation between two objects that is like they're meeting in eBay. Both are for sale in eBay. So it's like eBay is like kind of Tinder for objects. So the little gnome says, since I last saw you, some of us have grown or just grown old. We have wings at brightness, wheels bathing in subtle hues of mild radiation. Sage then cracked in the flux of humidity, shivered, sweated, and being blown by breeze. And yet, you don't seem to have aged at all. You need to get out more. Gail? Oh, Gal? Okay, so is that kind of sense? No, it's like this debate that we were having about, should we restore, should we embrace ephemerality? So I think there's no answers, it's just questions that everybody has to address on their own. So, and again, and this is like we are going into the kind of botch jobs that famously, but I mean, for us in reality, just it is part of the same thing. It's not something more wrong with this kind of Disneyfication of the amateur restoration as it is the proper restoration of it. I don't know, I think that is, at least it's adding time to that thing, and it can be recognized as something that happened in that moment instead of trying to just play the role of the, oh no, nothing happened. No? So, oh, the sound. Oh.
Has had 17 new heads and 14 new handles in its time.
Okay, so no introduce this, so otherwise
Okay.
it's hard to.
I mean, introduce it. Introduce it.
I'm going to introduce. So this is a program only Fools and Horses. It's a very British TV program you may have seen or no. And so these guys, they always pretend to be cool and they're selling things on the street. And they're in the pub and they're having a conversation. And it's about the story of the ship of Theseus. It's about if one thing, if you keep restoring and changing, is that thing the same thing at the end? So in this episode, they talk about that paradigm, or what would you say?
Yeah, paradigm. So it's like the guy who is the road sweeper is Trigger, and he's just been given an award for being a good sweeper. So he has a picture of himself with the mayor, and he's holding his broom. So this is the conversation.
This old broom has had 17 new heads and 14 new handles in its time.
How the hell can it be the same bloody broom?
Well, here's a picture of it. What more proof do you need?
So, I mean, in case you didn't understand, he says it's had 17 new handles and 14 new heads of the broom. So it's like they're questioning, so how can it be the same broom? And I have a picture of it, you know. So it's a bit, we'll have to go faster. It is a picture of it, anyway. It is about this idea of the restoration again. It's like, are we just creating new things, or are we maintaining the old ones? And then we got into this idea of the museum. So this is, we kind of divided the idea of the galleries as time machines. So when we're talking about time machines, in this you have the movie of the little girl with the shadow. And it's like, for us, we all often talk about the idea of, or the realization of the play of light and shadow as the discovery of the first binary code. I think the binary code allows you to allow people from the very beginning to realize that the transformation of reality can happen through storytelling. And I think that that's the same kind of device that the white room achieves. The white room generates the light that erodes the context, but it completely collapses what is time and space, and anything that is in that space can then be regenerated into a kind of either, like we were talking this morning, a virtual experience or some sort of thing. It allows us to play with the format across time and space in the same way that we do in a film, we think. So then we were thinking that there are other museums that become time capsules that are about collecting and preserving these objects for future generations to try to understand who we are. So suddenly there's a lot of talk about the idea of colonizing, and these ideas are just partly there because these museums are sited in a place. But if suddenly, instead of being a place, they were independent structures that were traveling around collecting and showing the works. So we could have the Victoria and Albert Museum traveling to, I don't know, to Greece. You could also get organize the Frieze Fair in a massive jet. But anyway, it's this idea of trying to change the parameter. What will happen is suddenly what is moving is what normally it is fixed. And we think that that is something that is important, and suddenly what will it mean when suddenly museums they start being independent? They become like a kind of pirates. Will they start fighting? Will they start trying to get the goods from other museums to become the one museum? And this story will carry on into space. So these are the two museums remaining. That is the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum, fighting to be the last museum in the galaxy. So these are the kind of things that are kind of persistent. And with this, we are almost there, sorry. So something that is like a recurring annoyance. And we go back to, not now the ship of Theseus, but the ship of Theseus. So this is about cloning and industrial production. So it's like the same way that we were thinking before, if one object gets all its parts removed and exchanged, does it remain the same object? We can start thinking also, is an industrial product, is it always the same object? Or a clone ship, is it the same person, or is it suddenly, it is not the quality of the material of the object, but the life that this object has had. And this is like what we talk in the fanzine about the idea of the fifth dimension. The fifth dimension is like all this, like the multiverse. No? So it's like we could, in theory, we know that there are all these infinite parallel dimensions where things are happening. And the only thing that is common to that is kind of things that are replicated in this way. You know? So it's like when we see a plate in a museum that is being mass-produced, is that place any more valuable than the one that you have at home where you had your dinners with your family? So it's like the story and the context of those objects, they are the ones that really give value. So time becomes three-dimensional. It's not just linear, but every time you have time happening in many different places at the same time with the same object. And we're just going to finish. You can do this one.
We just, because we are running out of time, so we come back to the beginning and they painted the mountain white, which is started with the students. They were working towards this publication, and they were thinking in the future when there is no glaciers and there is no snow, they can still paint the mountains and have the view. So you will still, in some crazy way, maintain something of the past, which is the question of restoration. What is what you keep? And then looking in the internet, there is the case that in Peru in 2010, they actually painted their glacier white, and because it does work actually to the rays of sun, they are repelled, so they are able to keep more water. So this crazy idea that sounded as a nostalgic, impossible thing, it is actually a reality. So we just have a very short clip about how they are painting the glaciers white in Peru.
I think there's no, maybe.
One of the strangest sights you'll ever see at such a high altitude. In a remote corner of the Peruvian Andes, men are hard at work painting a mountain peak. It's the first step in an experimental plan to recuperate Peru's melting Andean glaciers. The man behind the idea is not a glaciologist, but an inventor, Eduardo Gold.
I really hope that this could regrow a glacier here, because we are recreating all the climatic conditions necessary for a glacier to form.
The idea is that when sunlight is reflected off a white or light-colored surface, solar energy passes back through the atmosphere and out into space, rather than warming the Earth's surface and contributing to the greenhouse effect. The paint is environmentally friendly, made from lime, industrial egg white and water. And plastic jugs rather than paintbrushes are used to return this extinct glacier to its original colour. The workers plan to paint the whole summit some 20 hectares, an area 10 times bigger than what they've painted so far. This project has given hope to the local village, Le Capa, that it may soon be able to replenish its water supply, which has dwindled since Glacier melted.